guess I'll kind of start with a little bit of a question. I
Mhm.
wanted to ask you about the title of the show. The show is called Visitor. It's your first show in Los Angeles, first solo show in Los Angeles, right?
It was very loose title, something that wouldn't describe what you're seeing as much as it could be perceived as me being the visitor or the spectator being the visitor, or just referring to an immigration status, something that would give like a point of view slightly from the outside of things, like an observer rather than but it was a very loose title. It wasn't. I was when I was sorry when I was constructing the show, I was I really wanted to focus on the space where the paintings are where between the paintings, try to make it as something that isn't empty, but where the connections, where the associations, where the active, as an active space, not as empty.
I mean, I feel like actually that idea of the active space in between the paintings is often relegated to the visitor, right? To the person coming in to see that space and to kind of create the connections between the works based on their body in space. There's this incredible feeling of going into your exhibition in Los Angeles and feeling really guided by the different pieces. And actually this painting here, Bang, right? Is that the title of this piece?
Yeah.
Is a great example of how the paintings end up having these relationships with each other that kind of allow you to navigate the space. Like this one has a little bit of a wayfinding feel to it because you enter the gallery and you sort of follow the direction of the pointed fingers and such. So
a picture that would be as much almost as a signage as much as a picture, as well as being a double image, as in the fingers that it's a picture of a finger that pictures a gun, or the act of. But it's and there's another painting in the show which is even more precise, which is called This, which is really just a pointing finger with no indication of mimicking anything other than the gesture of pointing at something.
Yeah, so it's interesting how they have this one experience when they're a painting within themselves, like a solo painting, you sort of read it as this signifier and as this thing, but when they're in the context of the exhibition, they also start to address the other works. And I feel like that's something that happens in this show, that the works kind of address each other. But it made me wonder if when you made the exhibition, were you thinking really about individual pieces, or were you thinking about them as a whole, like as a set, What's your working process with that?
It was progressive, but it was definitely about making them kind of talk to each other. Because what I find a bit sometimes disappointing in how people perceive painting is that they tend to perceive them as disconnected from their context and their environment, whereas of course everything you read everything in context with what's next to it. More and more the works that I'm doing tend to comment on each other, whether I have paintings where another painting become, because I only make paintings about things one can see, even though they're not realistic or naturalistic. They're always about the visible world, but to push the idea of how to represent the visual world maybe a little bit further, even I have some paintings that have my own paintings in them that I've made prior to This exhibition doesn't have any, but the London one did, for example. And that's also the solo show that I did in New York had one. It's called The Studio, and it had one of the paintings actually in the show in an interior. But it's one of the reasons why I started doing the 2-part paintings that I call déjà vu. So you would have to take into context the space separating the 2 paintings, and hopefully that way you would also see the other paintings in a different way, because the 2 paintings are one piece, but they're not hanging by each other. So hopefully this forces you to take into context everything, or the space separating them, and getting from one to the next, or just turning your head, but not, the split second that separates vision of the one from the other.
Right. In fact, actually, it's interesting that you bring up, I think that stream of consciousness that you described, of like making a painting and then that leading you to making another painting, or one painting appearing in another painting. It feels, even though that device is not used in this show, it feels very present, because Visitor, I learned from doing a little bit of research, is the title of a past work of yours, right?
Yeah.
Was that on your mind when you made this whole exhibition? Like, were you building off of something from the past?
Maybe slightly, but not very specifically. I mean, you saw the Visitor, but the Visitor, the original painting that has the shadow of the man, was kind of, I thought of 2 paintings. There was the one, the Picasso studios, where you have the shadow that throws itself on the model and in the objects and on the studio. And the other one was, I think there is a painting, I can't remember if it was the Homecoming or the Visitor. I think it's Ilya Repin painting, where the soldier's coming home and he's staring at this doorstep. But as you pointed out, there's a second painting called The Morning Sun, which was born from this painting, where the character has already disappeared, where it's all geometrics. But the title of this show, no, I don't think so. I kind of had it in my pocket. I wanted to do a show called The Visitor for a while.
Well, I understand that instinct, because I think in reading a lot about your work, people bring up this idea of voyeurism. Like, there's a sense of voyeurism in experiencing your work, which I think is, also the notion of an intruder, visitor, outsider looking in.
Yeah, it's just suggests someone, a sort of a point of view.
Yeah, which I also, sorry, go ahead.
It's visitor, not visitors, because it's like a singular perspective.
Yeah. And I also feel like I've heard you say before that, point of view is almost something we take for granted when we look at paintings, especially, but images in general now. And in your exhibition, that's so specific, because the point of view is, and maybe always in your work, so carefully framed. And there's this question that ends up happening when you're looking at the work of, the viewer, the visitor looking at the painting, is standing exactly where you were standing when you were
exactly.
Yeah. I don't know if there's more you want to say about that, but I've heard you say that, this sort of like transference, or this kind of handing.
That's part of the fascination that people have for painting, because it is, if it's not so perfect as to look like an industrial object, you do have the traces of I was here, and that it's an original piece, and you have the traces of the person who was standing where you are standing when you are looking at it. It's always you're always standing where the audience was standing, and maybe that's also why the subjective camera of the cinema is kind of similar in a way. I mean, not all cameras in cinema are subjective, obviously, but when they are, there's something similar about it, about looking at a painting in a way. Yeah,
I'm glad you brought up cinema. It's totally where I wanted to go next, because framing is such a big part of your work, and you talk about it across different mediums, the history of painting, but also cinema, and the language of cinema, that includes like close up or wide shot, or those kinds of devices are really being played with. Oh, this is a great painting to look at, for example, like in terms of the kind of the cinematic. And I want to talk to you about this because I know that there's a kind of point of friction for you in when people describe the paintings, the pictures as cinematic and narrative, or what your relationship to the notion of narrative is. So
yeah, because I know that I think that the feeling of cinematic mostly comes from the fact that you can see that there's something you're not seeing, which is a device that we've learned by looking at cinema, which is, well, basically the off-screen that I use quite a lot. But firstly, to make the pictures as simple as possible, like here, you actually only have 1, 2, 3, 4 curves and a straight line, and that's it. There's nothing else in the picture. But you're suggesting that there's something outside the picture. You're suggesting that there's a car. There's no car in the picture. There's no and one reason to do this is to make it as simple as possible, but more importantly, and I think that's why people don't think about cinematic, is because you immediately project things outside the painting. So that's why I think that my paintings need a lot of space around them as well, because they hopefully expand beyond what you're seeing, because there's so much that is only suggested, but there's not. I wouldn't call it narration. There's no. I very much think about what information I'm giving in each picture, so that it is the bare minimum, but at the same time, if I can make it, well, first of all, contemporary, that we know that we're not in the 18th century, that is always useful. And that you don't, if I can give some specification, but in a very simple graphic manner, like, I don't know, the Adidas stripes or something that is just basically abstract, but very precise. Or something, yeah.
I want to come back to this idea of abstract, but just to stay on cinema for a second, I also read an interview in which you described the making of your paintings as kind of like making a movie. And I guess I should correct myself, because you don't really use you prefer not to use the language of paintings when you're talking about your work. You prefer to use the language of pictures, which I feel like is also very related to.
I like to say I paint pictures.
You paint pictures.
Because it's not process based. I mean, each painting is a specific project. It's not. I don't work on several paintings at the same time or improvise or whatever. Each painting is a project, and I made the reference to cinema because that there were 3 stages. There was the first where I note down, I would like to paint such and such a picture in such and such a manner, and I make lists of ideas, basically, which, so it always starts with words, even though it's very banal and boring, but and then I start to imagine how I could make this into a picture that I would like to paint, and how it so I start working on a sketch, which would be like the equivalent would be like having a pitch or a script and then going to a storyboard. And when the storyboard is done, then you go to this. I go to the studio and do start working on the actual painting. But a lot of it has been decided prior to actually starting a painting.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's also extremely, I think, unusual for a painter to start with words. I know that you stress that they're banal and that they're just a list, or that they're just words for you, but I think it's really, it's unusual, and it feels really rich, because, like, can you say more about that language and your relationship to language?
I think that the paintings, they always depict something from the visible world, but as you can see, they're very, very simple in the way they're made. And I think they're often almost like if I was showing and naming at the same time, saying, banner, birthday, etc. And it almost correspond to words as much as the actual thing you would see in the world. It's probably, I mean, partly because they start off as words, but also this level of because I don't use photography as a source material, so I have to like imagine what would a tree look like. It probably wouldn't look like any tree you would see outside in the world. Wouldn't be able to say what's its species is, what kind of tree it is, but you'd still recognize there's a tree. You'd know it corresponds to the idea of a tree, and you can't really do that with photography. So there's this level of abstraction that you get with words that you wouldn't get if I was only focused on on imitating what I can see.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you started from a photograph, well, by starting with language instead of a photograph, you end up kind of stripping bare the assumptions of what the thing is from the beginning. You're sort of starting from a skeleton or an idea of something rather than the thing itself.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of a memory as well. I mean, I think it kind of look more like how I would describe things than how things actually are. Mm-hmm. So in a very imperfect and general and sometimes strange way, but it's still describing the world.
Yeah. You know, that space between, you've told me recently about this idea of like sitting down and saying, I'm going to draw a tree in general. And I think this word general that you use a lot is very interesting because in general implies a kind of collectivity, but then also it implies like your own subjective notion of what in general means, like what it means to kind of pare down. And the process of paring down is such a big part of your work, right? Like paring things down as far as they could possibly be pared down.
Yeah, but like you said, I'm definitely interested in, do you see what I see? I mean, I'm not, even though the latest paintings, like the lake that we're seeing now is bordering more on abstraction and instead of immediate recognizability that was before. But a lot of the paintings do have this quality that, like, I've seen this before, that they're already kind of in the collective imagination somewhere. And I think that's one of the interesting things. I think that where we have individuality is lovely, but I think we have more in common than we like to admit, that we do kind of have so many set examples on how to experience different situations in life that we do tend to apply those patterns that they're quite similar, because we're storytellers. We tell ourselves the stories of our lives, and we have models for this since we were born. There are so many of them that it's what makes it possible to enjoy art as well. You know.
I wonder if your relationship to this kind of the idea of a common experience or of a kind of generalization in that way is also related, just to stay on language for one more second, is also related to, I mean, you must be at least trilingual, right? I feel like you have many languages that you probably juggle, being, you know, from Finland. Yeah, based in Paris. And, you know, it seems like from researching your work that most of the language used in your work is in English. Is that how you write also when you begin? Like, do you begin in English, or is there
no translation? Depends, but I mean, I function in French day to day because I live in France. I did the titles in English. Actually, I started giving them for a very practical reason. At that time I was living in France and showing my work a lot in Finland, which is also a bilingual country. There's two official languages, Finnish and Swedish, and you tend to sometimes put things in, make translations in English for foreigners, and then if I give titles in French, they seem weird. So English is the one language, if I give titles, nobody's going to ask me to translate them. It's just like, it's.
And also, I mean, it allows you to do this thing you do. This painting is, I'm so glad we're resting on this painting for a moment, because I wanted to talk about it. This painting is titled The Hand, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the hand singular, which has the double entendre, you know, the double meaning of the hand of cards, like what would be another word for the hand of cards? And then the hand that's holding the cards, or at least like talking about just one hand. So I feel like the utility also of English as a language, or focusing on one language, is allowing you to have these kind of double meanings, or maybe triple meanings.
I mean, you can do that in French too. It's not, but not with this specific one, but you can do a lot of wordplay in French, and that's probably why the surrealist writers were French, because there's so many, in French language, there are so many meanings for one word in general, like more than in English. But no, it was really because it would, if I did the titles in French, I would be asked to translate them at some point, or most people would ask, what does this mean? Whereas in English, most people speak English, nobody's going to ask me to translate them.
Mm-hmm. It's a kind of, it's the
practicality.
International art English, some have called it.
Yeah, and not even art, I mean, everywhere.
Do you want to say anything about this painting? I wanted to talk about this one in particular within your show, because, you know, just to kind of recap for the audience, even though they probably have it in mind, like, you know, the exhibition contains these fingers that are, you know, these hand gestures are pointing you in different directions. It has this like road illuminated by an absent car. You know, it has this empty swimming pool. You know, there's a lot that sets you up to feel a certain way about being in the space, and then you find yourself in front of this human form, or this parts of the human form that are kind of holding its cards close to its chest. How did, you know, in the stream of consciousness of making this show, how did you arrive at this painting, and what does it mean to you?
To be honest, a lot of the paintings come first for very formalist considerations. I like to, when I start working on a drawing, I don't start from nothing, because I already have this rectangle of the canvas. So I like to replay it in the composition when possible, or if I can mime it in a way in the subject that I represent. I mean, the cards are flat rectangular objects in themselves. And of course, being that it's a hand of cards, even though you know that the information is, the point of holding a hand of cards is not to show your hand, obviously. And also to be able to replay the rectangle as the absent shoulders of the torso. It was not so much about the idea of a game or anything, but
I mean, I think when I looked at it, I kind of read it as what you don't see, or what you don't get to see, you know, which I think is a big part of just your work in general, like how much we get to see versus how much we don't get to see. And in this painting, as well as in another one that's in the show called Night Call, you have not only sort of what's off screen, but there's also, I don't know, I actually felt like these sort of these allowed the viewer to project a lot. I hate to say narratively, because you're pushing up against it, but of all the paintings,
the title Night Call. I mean, if you didn't have the title Night Call, it would be less of a.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't be 100%, you know, I mean, I guess it's debatable, but I would say I wouldn't be 100% sure that this is a phone ringing, you know, also, if it didn't have the title Night Call. So the title does play a really integral part of it, but also there's this thing about the hand and Night Call, that they have this extreme mystery to them, and also this total banality to them. You know, they're they really sort of walk that tightrope of, this could be an extremely charged moment, or it could be just a very everyday moment. I wondered if you were looking for that in these particular pieces, especially because the show in Los Angeles has a little bit of a noir feel to it. I don't know if that ended up being something that I'm reading into it.
I like the word suspense.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like drawn elastic, you know, it's could be nothing, it could be something.
Yeah, I think that's a great word for your name, or word to define your work in general, you know, this idea of suspense. Earlier, just a moment ago, you brought up surrealist writers, and I think I wanted to lean in on this a little bit, because in our preliminary conversation for this talk, you expressed a desire to push back against or reject the label that often gets given to your work, of that it has a quality of surreal, or the surreal, or of surrealism. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I feel like you were very passionate about it.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's something that gets thrown around a lot, and so that's why I try to put a lot of emphasis on the fact that every single painting represents something from the visible world. There is nothing fantastical ever about them. Nobody has two heads. Nothing's impossible. Everything is very plausible and banal when possible as well. It's not, so it's very the opposite what people first think about surrealism. I mean, there's a lot of like we talked about suspense. There's a lot of strangeness. There's a lot of maybe even uncanny, but it's not surreal. Surreal is for me something different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's not.
The definition of the uncanny is the familiar made strange, and it has to be rooted in the existing, right? Which I feel like is such a big part of how you talk about your work. Something that you might have known already, like a déjà vu, or something that is a kind of found image. I was also reading somebody describing your work as this, like a found image, which isn't exactly true. It's not, but maybe an existing image. I don't know. How do you think about that?
They're all constructions, so there's no found. There's nothing found in them. They're really constructions, lines, and you know, really start working on the composition as a very formal thing. But yeah, I do think there's something often that makes you think, I've already seen this. Something that's already there, without being any specific image.
Which is where maybe and how you got to the déjà vu paintings that you brought up earlier, right? That there's something that you can also build out of nowhere, like the image doesn't exist, but you make an image that has the feeling of already being something you know, and then you're kind of multiplying that by making many of them, or two of them.
Yeah, but I think the notion of doubles in the work was already there. I mean, even in the lake, the picture is split in two and doubled. Double as the reflection or the representation of the world, or sometimes even just a shadow. But there's like the idea of picture making as like doing something that is like the ghost of the world. I don't know how to explain it. And so there's a lot, yeah, when there's a lot of doubling in
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about scale.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a range of scales in the show in Los Angeles. There's larger paintings and smaller paintings, but also within each painting, there's a lot of attention to scale. And sometimes that scale is reflected in texture. You know, various details have different textures or surfaces that allow you to sort of hone in on them. Like there's a painting named Pink Bathrobe, is that right? Where the the bathrobe itself has a really, really rich texture. And then there's just the flimsiest little eyelash on the figure. And so I think, yeah, I guess this is a kind of two-part question around your choices around scale with the exhibition, like how you pick the various sizes of the pieces, and then also, yeah, how you use texture and surface in the work.
There's an overall idea of the scale as soon as there's an idea. But it isn't, I don't decide until the sketch is done. I mean, it depends on a variety of factors, like you said, like in the pink bathroom, if we could just maybe see the pink bathrobe. There's because there's the necessary size for the texture has to be a certain size for the texture that mimics the wet hair. It would be correct. But other than there's like few rules that I've always found that if I go around them, it doesn't work, is that classical painting tends to be smaller than the one-on-one size. We don't have a lot of enlargements until the arrival of cinema and big billboards and so forth. So most classic, I've never done a small landscape. It just feels in my paintings strange because I try to make them as objects in space, and so that would look like I was looking through a window in a way. So they're always larger or the same size, more or less, than what they are depicting. But at the same time, being as I'm making some very simplified images, I don't want them to get to this huge pop art size. Also, I mean, like for this one, it's not very large. It's also so that you would have this objecthood that I'm looking to give them their presence. If it's too big, that it loses it as well. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense.
No, you are, because I think what you're saying is here, for example, the figure is not one-to-one scale. It's not the size of a head when you're standing next to it, right? Like it's
quite a lot larger.
In some ways it's more controlled, and it's controlled in relationship to what you're trying to do with the image, and that control makes the thing that you've made more of an object rather than I don't know, solely a visual representation of something. So it doesn't have that like
yeah, but the size gives you a feeling of being closer or further away from things as well. And this is a little bit larger, so you do kind of get the feeling that you're breathing down the neck of the person. So it's not entirely.
Yeah, and then I feel also like scale commands different relationships of the body of the viewer to the piece, right? Like when something is larger, you can have a kind of multiple reads based on distance. When something is smaller, you sort of have this more intimate kind of unfolding or kind of reveal as you're in front of it. And this painting and a few others in your exhibition were so striking to me to see in person, because there's parts of the painting where the paint is so thin that it really betrays the canvas. It really sort of stresses the presence of the canvas, which I think participates in that object making that you described.
Yeah,
like it says, like, I am a thing, you know? And then in the same exact painting, and this one's a great example, there's a contrast with paint application that is so layered, you know, so thick, you know, it's not actually really thick in this one, but you know, so thick that it then also becomes a kind of like sculptural element into it. Yeah, I think the thick and thins has really become a kind of signature move also for you.
Well, it's like for this one, it's the paint that is mimicking the subject almost more than figuring it. But I don't want it to be systematic. So it's not like you will find texture, certain type of texture, or the thick and thin in every single painting I do. It should never become a system.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe that was reductive when I said it was
No,
kind of,
no, not at all, not at all. I'm just
it's a
That's-
technique I feel like you've really honed in on. And actually, there was an older work that I was thinking of in relationship to this one that we put into the presentation called Fur, that maybe we could look at as well, that I think is a great way to talk also about how if your process, and we've talked about it so far in terms of framing and, you know, image picture making is about I've read people use the word restraint, you know, this idea of like, how much can you leave out in order to still maintain the picture? Texture also functions like that for you, right? Like, how much texture do you need? How can you use it to create information? Like I've heard you talk about this hand and its relationship to texture.
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously people might recognize that was kind of imitating the hand in Durer's self-portrait, where he has this fur collar and his fingers are like thick, embedded in the fur. But it was also how sort of a lesson on how to make something convey, in this instance, the softness or thickness of the fur by that you just need that one spot somewhere where the information, because we do, I mean, even looking at paintings, we do kind of look them the same way as we do, well, anything really. We assimilate information and induce and say that if this hand is, if it's soft here, it'll be soft everywhere else. So you kind of immediately feel like the rest of it is it's you don't need more.
It's nice also that you brought up, and this painting obviously brings up Durer, the self-portrait. I wanted to ask you a question about references, because in our conversation today, you know, you've talked about cinema. There's in this piece and various past works, there's also references to the history of painting. There's also in some of your works references to literature. And I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about how you like to talk about in relation to your work, your references, because sometimes you make very direct references to art history and to specific things in art history, but then also they're so wide reaching, like they can be Durer, they could be Guy Butt, they can be Velasquez, they can be Jeff Wall, photographer, or Hokusai, you know, Japanese artist. And so how do you think of references? How do you like to talk about references and art historical references? Yes.
Well, I like to point out if they're in a specific painting like here, where the reference is quite very direct, but more than in most paintings, I do like. But like, why did I refer to this self-portrait of Durer? It's because of this lesson that I learned from it about how to. It's about learning from the paintings, from the art that I'm and it's like the same how I prefer to instead of copying nature with my sketchbook out there or whatever, I prefer to observe and try to understand and deduce the rule that makes it that this could be like this, and then take it to the studio and work on the sketch. And it's kind of the same procedure as looking at art. It's not different for me from looking at the world in and the idea is to and if I can, so I can combine these these observations with just thoughts about the object that I'm making itself, which is this painting on canvas, which is a flat object, goes on the wall, has a grid of the canvas. Paint has certain qualities. It had and its history and everything. It makes it more it makes it to exist. It makes a more I wouldn't say valid object, but I would say an object that exists for real. I mean, trying to make something that exists for real. I don't know how to say otherwise, that is very much present.
You mean something that might have seemed so not alienating, but far distant by being part of a canon or of a history or of the past becomes more real also because it's animated by these kind of real contemporary situations that are then learning from those lessons, or that are
well, no, I didn't mean that particularly in terms of art history. I meant about why make a painting at all? For me, no, I think that it's just that, well, painting has such a long history and the medium hasn't really changed. I mean, it's apart from, we can buy industrially produced paint instead of having 10 assistants to grind the paint for us. It hasn't really changed that much. So you can, it's the weirdness of the medium is that you can like look at Velázquez and, understand one detail, one thing from him and take it to my studio and do something completely contemporary with it. It's not, it hasn't changed that much. And it's still, technically particularly, but also.
I mean, you can also give yourself the credit of being somebody who can really see that. I feel like you're really reading also these works from the past and identifying these kind of.
But you also cannot ignore the thousands of years of history. You just have to drag them with you, in my point of view. Because if you don't, I mean, that's what, if I might think painting is fascinating and a little exhausting sometimes, it's because it has such a weird position in terms of the medium. It's been so, I mean, particularly after modern art, it was so. The medium, the most. I mean, if you ask, if you open a comic book, if you see a painting, and it's most likely going to be an oil on canvas, medium size. It's like the archetype. What is an art object? It's the archetype. So it has this exemplary quality to it. So I'm almost trying to make like paintings of paintings in a way. Like it's not, they're almost pictures of themselves in a way.
That's beautiful. We're sort of leaning towards the end, and so there's a couple more things I want to be able to talk about. Could we switch to the painting Nonstop? And then I'm gonna say, I guess, to the public that we're game to answer, right? Some Q&A, or Henni is willing to answer some Q&A. So if you want to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, I can read them out loud. And yeah, I guess there's just a couple more things I feel like I'll ask you while we're sort of seeing if we receive some questions. It's almost, this is the beginning, this is the painting that you begin with when you enter your exhibition in Los Angeles, but it's kind of interesting to end on it. It's such an interesting work because it's kind of a new gesture for you. It's a different kind of gesture where in the past, and actually maybe we can click through a couple of the past works, you've used obstruction as a way of breaking up an image, especially a textual image. This one uses the physical space of the gallery, or the physical space between the paintings, to create a break. And, it's not such a stretch from us just talking about art history or the ways in which you sort of learn a lesson, because in our preliminary conversation, you brought up obviously the influence of John Baldessari, or maybe it wasn't the influence, actually, maybe it was the realization later of the kinship to John Baldessari's work that piece has in particular. I don't know if you want to say something about the Nonstop painting that is in the LA show. So we address that.
I mean, it's funny because I feel like that's the other one was the Nonstop for New York. This was the Nonstop for LA. Which the Nonstop in New York was kind of like a rainy night in New York on a neon projected on a car hood, like a, I don't know, 70s Corsi film. Whereas the Nonstop in LA, we talked about yeah, I talked about some LA artists that I thought about during the show, like at Rocher and Baldassari. Yeah, particularly Baldassari, because I just recently realized about an idiot I've been, that I've never really thought about the connection, how important the connection like between words and pictures and it's just this, the abstraction and all those things that I never really looked that hard at his work, and now I'm just flabbergasted. I don't know why. It was just like a chance encounter. I did a show in London at a gallery that shows them in LA, and I ran into one of the pieces from his last series, The Space Between. And what a great title, by the way. I mean, so jealous. He has such great titles.
Language.
It's not that. I mean, I would kill for a title like that. I mean, it's incredible. It would, yeah. I thought about, because I was, like I said, I was preoccupied with a lot about the space between the paintings during when I was constructing the show. So I kind of thought a lot about the Baldassari In Between series. In the end, well, obviously this doesn't look anything like his work, and my work doesn't look anything like his work, which is great, because it's always great to realize you have something in common with an artist who doesn't function at all like you. Whatever his work doesn't at all, is not in the same medium, doesn't look anything like it, and I think that's very, very interesting. So yeah, it's a two-piece painting, but unlike the déjà vus, they are hanging next to each other. They just have a specific amount of things missing in between, which corresponds to the letters non-stop that are, plus the hyphen that is in the middle.
And it's such a great work, I think, to talk about sort of a combination of all things we've already talked about, which is like your use of what's outside of the frame, or the kind of gestalt, right, that a viewer has, their ability to complete an image or to complete a thought.
That's what I realized when I was, sorry, I'm horrible at intro. I'm so sorry.
Go ahead, Henni, totally, please.
That I realized I wanted to do, I had this desire to incorporate letters or words into my work for a long time, and I didn't realize until I learned a lesson from the Cubists that actually what was bothering me was to give the thing whole, like the same thing as exactly the same thing, like you said, with the other type of images, other type of representation that are having the paintings, is that when it's given whole, for me, it kind of closes the painting on itself. It's ended, it's done. Whereas when you have to complete it, you really have to, you're looking, you're not just seeing anymore.
Yeah, you should say a bit more about that, because I think that, like, the difference between looking and seeing.
Well, I mean, seeing is passive and looking is something that is intentional. You have to look at something, you have to you have to do, you have to, it's something you just you do, it's not something that happens.
I think this is a really great full circle, because it does kind of bring it back to this title, whether conscious or not, of the visitor. You know, there's this kind of complicity of the viewing eye, whether it's yours or eventually the visitors. That is a huge part of how you're thinking about these works, or how they're made whole, without being limited to the sort of constraint to the frame. So we only have one question, and the question is mostly just that your work is loved, and that people are asking where they can see it and where they can access it. And so the answer is right now at Karma in LA. And then maybe this is a great segue to talk about the next thing you're working on. Are you able to talk about what it is, or is it secret? We don't know.
It's not secret. I'm doing a series of paintings because I'm doing a show at the National Contemporary Art Museum in Helsinki called Kiasma. in September. So I'm doing a group of works for that one, more or less around the idea, but more specifically around the perception between the differences and weirdness of perception and knowledge, and also about showing and naming, as I talked before, but the similarities and differences when about yeah, kind of hard to pin that down.
It's hard to talk about something while you're doing it, but when you described it to me the other day, you described a series, or I guess a series, correct me if I'm wrong, 6 paintings maybe, that allowed you to think through the difference between knowledge and perception, right? And that the definition of knowledge for you was kind of, as we're talking about the nonstop painting, like knowledge is kind of filling in the information. Right? If you're telling someone to paint a hand, they're going to paint 5 fingers, even though you rarely see all 5 fingers, depending on the position.
That's the knowledge will between the knowledge influences your recollection and perception of what you think you saw.
Is something that you're thinking about that knowledge, that we kind of move through the world with knowledge, and that knowledge overrides perception? Does knowledge?
No, but there's no perception without interpretation.
Oh, yeah.
And we interpret by knowledge because of everything we've accumulated before. You can't you can't see anything if you don't know what you're seeing. You can't, there's this short story by Borges where he describes this guy who goes to a house and he goes crazy because what he sees, the furniture, everything is so strange that he cannot describe it. He cannot put words on it. So he goes nuts because he has nothing. It is so weird that it looks like nothing he has ever seen. It's like, and also, everybody, when you walk down the street, you don't notice most of things because the world is full of myriads of tiny details and things. Your brain decides with what's important, what is not, in function of, according to what it has already learned, and what he thinks is normal, what he thinks is not normal, and so it doesn't. It very much picks what you perceive. We don't see most of things. Yeah. Even in a fixed image, you have a lot of museums doing this. Like, how much do you see in a painting? You see very little. It's very, very, very specific what you pay attention to, because we're particularly our conscious part of our thinking is very, very limited, actually. That's why I like to work not to instead of fixating on saying that I will do this is what I'm interested in, and I will do a series on paintings on this particular subject, and like empty the subject in a scholarly manner. I think that my brain just doesn't work that way. First of all, it just goes spiraling all over. But also, I think I don't know. It's not like not the unconscious, but not the undescribable thoughts are faster when you're an image maker. So it's not, I suppose people call it intuition, but it's not magic. It's just that your everything you have accumulated, just you think in a level that goes faster when you don't have to articulate it.
It's interesting and a beautiful place to end, I think, because the idea of knowledge, which you define as a kind of intuitive way of moving through the world with accumulated knowledge, is also so related to just learning from the past or from past experience, which I feel like you lean into when you talk about your references or the stuff that you've learned from and that you use. And so that process of learning from something and then using it to move forward or to create a new idea or picture, or it maps across different parts of your process.
Yeah, I used to think I was like a one big sponge. I mean, I used to like read all the literary classics so that I could somehow become the zeitgeist or something, but like to accumulate and see everything, to be able to, like I said, like, do you see what I see? To find that common thing that is floating in that.
Yeah, across time, across this time, across past times.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're up to our time, and we haven't received. Oh, there was one more question. Philip, do you think we have time for one more question? Oh, it's a very simple question, actually. You can answer this, Henni, and then we can maybe end. Which is, do you use photography when you paint?
No.
And yeah, and the second part of the question is, what do you think about the relationship between the photograph and the painting?
In what respect?
Well, they haven't clarified, but I thought it was an interesting second part, because it's an easy no to say you don't use photography when you're making your pictures, but you do think about photography in the sense that there's, at least one painting that thinks through Jeff Wall. So what the contrast and the relationship between photography and painting?
Well, I look at all pictures, not just paintings. I mean, I look at photographers, I look at cinema, I mean, I look at TV nowadays. And I look at all picture making. It's just that, it hasn't, if you go to, there isn't any photographs in the 17th century, but I don't just look at painting. I mean, but in regards to relationship painting and photography, it really, I don't know which angle this question is leaning on.
I had read you give a response to the relationship between photography and painting once. I thought that was, what was it? Was it related to actually this notion of narration or of time? It's kind of like fixed time in photography. It's about that. And then the painting has this kind of different relationship to time. Am I imagining that? I thought I had read you talk about painting and photography in dialogue with each other.
No, it's just, well, photography is always something very specific.
Oh yeah, okay, that's what it is. You mentioned it earlier, the idea that if there's a photograph of a tree, it's a very specific tree. And
There's that tree, it's not even a species, it's that tree there that you're photographing. You can't do it any other way.
And that your painting can be this notion of the tree in general, and the tree as an image of a tree. Thank you for that. For a last minute question. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you so much, Karma. Thank you, Henni. Congratulations on your incredible show.
Thank you.